Hello again, everyone. My name is 𝐁𝐨𝐵𝐤, and I am a co-director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at the University of Hong Kong. As you may know, the center was established in 2012 by the Faculty of Law and by the LKS Faculty of Medicine, represented by my co-director, Dr. Philip Bay. We'd like to acknowledge our donor, the Wing Foundation, which has generously supported many of our activities since its founding. So today we are delighted and honored to host a talk that is centered on recently published edited monograph that's called COVID-19 in Asia. So the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be an immense challenge for all of us at many different levels. And I'd like to first start off by saying that our thoughts are very much with colleagues or friends, everyone for that matter, who may have lost significant others to this particular pandemic. It is also a time, as we know, for solidarity, as no country or individual can overcome this challenge alone. This book, COVID-19 in Asia, is presented to us at a crucial moment because it speaks to our collective deficiencies in recognizing our interdependence, our ability to foster and maintain trust and promote participation. But at the same time, this book also speaks to resilience and hope. We have an ethical responsibility to learn from this extraordinary public health event in hope that we will do better in responding to the next outbreak. My colleague Daisy and I have had the privilege of contributing to this monograph, and would like to thank our colleague, Professor Po-Jen Yap, who's first got us involved, and also to Professor Victor Ramraj for his exceptional and excellent guidance throughout the entire process. We will be hearing from Daisy, my colleague, who is assistant professor at the Faculty of Law and also a member of the discussant panel. I'm first of all delighted to introduce the editor of this particular volume. We will first hear from Victor, who will share with us his thoughts about the work, how it came about, why we should pay attention to this particular work, and how he managed to galvanize everyone in such a short span of time in getting this very impressive volume together. Following Victor's presentation, we will hear from Professor Vivian Lin, who is Executive Associate Dean of the 𝐏𝐥𝐤𝐬 LKS School of Medicine, and also Professor of Public Health Practice at the Public Health Department. We will then hear from Dr. Matthew Little, who is Assistant Professor at the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria. Following Matthew's presentation of his thoughts on the volume, we will then hear from Daisy. So the general flow of event will be, first of all, hearing from Victor in terms of his thoughts on the work, and then followed by our very exceptional and excellent panelists. So with this, it's over to you, Victor. Let me just first say a few things about Victor. So Victor is not a stranger to 𝐏𝐥𝐤. Of course, he's very closely involved in many of our works, and also with one of our centers on comparative law and policy. Victor is a professor at the University of Victoria, and he has been in Singapore for 16 years, so also no stranger to the region. So Victor, let me invite you to share your experience with us, first of all, in relation to the work, and also in terms of how you think we should be moving forward in our responses to this particular pandemic.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening to those of you in Victoria. Thank you very much, Calvin. And thank you to all of your colleagues at the Center for Medicine, Ethics and Law for organizing this event. I'm really, truly grateful to all of you. And a special thanks also to Vivian Lin, Professor Lin, for agreeing to read the volume and to join us today. I am coming to you today from Victoria, BC, on the west coast of Canada. And although I'm not on the university campus this evening here, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples whose historical ties to the land continue to this day. I am truly honored and delighted to be here virtually at your center. And I'm delighted to be here for several reasons, but let me just mention three. First of all, I think it's a great privilege for the editor of a volume to have colleagues recognize and read and engage with this kind of work, and I'm really privileged to have this opportunity. I'm also, as Calvin mentioned, I have spent many years visiting the University of Hong Kong. My first visit was in 1993, a very long time ago, and since then I've been a regular visitor to the campus. But this is my first time speaking to your center, so I'm really delighted to do this. And there's also another personal reason why I'm particularly delighted to be speaking to your center, and that is because my very first research assistant position back in, I'm dating myself now, but back in 1988 was at McGill's Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law. And so in some ways, this is a bit of a homecoming, even if it is on an entirely different continent. Again, my sincere thanks. So Calvin has asked me to introduce the book in terms of its conceptualization, contributors, scope, organization, some key messages, audience, and impact. Now that's a fairly tall order in the 7 or 8 minutes that I have left. So let me see what I can do on that score. So let me share with you my slides. There is the cover of the volume. And just by way of context, my recent work, I won't go through all of the various paths that I've taken in my academic career, but of late, I have been working on emergency powers. That's been a focus of my work for a few years now. And also more recently, I've been working on transnational law and regulation. And so when the pandemic started, I felt almost compelled to do something on this topic. It clearly was an emergency, a global emergency. And it was also, as Calvin alluded to earlier, it was and continues to be a global challenge, a challenge of coordination, of solidarity, in Calvin Ho's words, of interdependence. So I felt very much compelled to do something to address the pandemic. So as I was thinking about the challenges, it struck me then, and I've since come across an excellent piece that I think helps to situate my thinking about the volume. And I'd like to suggest that COVID-19 is a kind of a wicked problem. So some of you might be familiar with the vast literature on wicked problems, spanning back to 1973, Weber and Ritschl's work. But I recently came across this passage, which I'd like to share with you, that I think captures in some ways the motivation of the volume, even if I hadn't at that point read these passages. So a wicked problem, says the authors, is a complex issue that defies complete definition, for which there can be no final solution, since any resolution generates further issues, and where solutions are not true or false or good or bad, but the best that can be done at the time. Such problems are not morally wicked, but diabolical in that they resist all the usual attempts to resolve them. So that's the author's attempt to capture this idea of a wicked problem. And their solution is this. The task is therefore to draw on all our intellectual resources, valuing the contributions of all the academic disciplines, as well as other ways in which we construct our knowledge. And that brings the challenge of developing open transdisciplinary modes of inquiry capable of meeting the needs of the individual, the community, the specialist traditions, and influential organizations, and allows for a holistic leap of the imagination. And this is from Brown and co-authors, a chapter called Towards a Just and Sustainable Future in a book called Tackling Wicked Problems. So this idea of COVID-19 as a wicked problem, I think, captures very well the spirit in which I and we as a collective of contributors approach the volume. And I think it adds a way of thinking about very complex problems that for those of us who are trained in the legal field may not always appreciate. So when I started law school, the image of law that I started with looked something like this. Law as a very hierarchical structure with a constitution at the top, or a basic law, and then state law that needs to comply with that constitution, and then a number of subsidiary laws and regulations, or possibly customary laws and other forms of other standards and other kinds of norms that must comply with a constitution. I think this way of thinking about law and policy is problematic because it fails to acknowledge the complexity of the world, of the policy world, of the legal world, and of a wicked problem such as COVID. And so I tend to think of law more in this sense, that there are many different ways, many different spheres for responding to a problem as large as COVID. We can think of state responses. Let me just grab my laser pointer here. So we tend to think of state responses or international responses, but there are all kinds of other bodies that, non-state actors, that work with us to address these kinds of problems. And it may be community organizations, it may be civil society organizations or NGOs, scientists, technological innovation, businesses, religious organizations, and as Calvin and Daisy have pointed out to us in their chapter, professional associations as well. So when I was thinking about the volume, I came at it from this perspective that we need to think about COVID-19 as a very complex, wicked problem. And so the book, as you will see, has taken a distinctly interdisciplinary approach. And in the course of putting together the volume, I made a point of reaching out to authors from a number of different disciplines, and wherever possible, encouraging co-authored chapters. We ended up with 61 contributors from a range of different disciplines. The book itself consists both of case studies of particular countries or territories and thematic chapters. And as you will see in the table of contents, those case studies and thematic chapters ended up being interwoven. Probably the biggest challenge, though, was addressing a moving target. And COVID, of course, was in the early days of working on this chapter, it was rapidly changing and the problems were rapidly multiplying. And so how do you approach a volume of that sort? We ended up having a two-tiered strategy. One was to think of the volume as what journalists call a first draft of history, to capture the challenge posed by the pandemic in the moment and document it to some degree, the experience of different countries and territories. The second element was that we all tried, where possible, to not necessarily focus on the moment, but to extrapolate to some of the enduring themes that emerged from the experience of different governments and different disciplinary areas. So the volume is broken down roughly as follows, just in broad strokes. Matthew Little and I had co-authored the introduction, which has essentially a short history of the pandemic as it unfolded in Asia, as well as a thematic overview. We then had a part one on first wave containment measures, part two on emergency powers, part three on technology, science, and expertise. And this is the section in which Calvin and Daisy's chapter appears. A fourth section with 7 chapters on politics, religion, and governance, looking at different experiences across the region. And finally, more of perhaps a forward-looking section on economy, climate, and sustainability. So that's the broad architecture of the volume. I thought I would end my opening remarks. I'm sorry if I'm going on a little bit long, but this is my last slide. There are a few enduring questions, and I'll just leave these with you. First, why is it that so many countries in Asia, if you look at the recent statistics, the epidemiology, why is it that many countries in Asia have fared relatively well in responding to the pandemic, despite differences in political systems? That I think is something that comes out of the volume. I think there are potentially some answers to that question as you probe through the chapters. But it's something that I think has puzzled many of us as we compare the different responses. Second, what difference does a territory's legal or political structure make? Is there a model relationship between politicians and expert advisors, including scientists and public health experts? Third, what is the role of non-state actors in responding to a global crisis, such as a pandemic? I mentioned some of those non-state actors, but once we recognize that multiple agencies or organizations are involved, we come back to that question that Calvin alluded to. Is coordination possible? Is it desirable? And if so, what form should it take? And then finally, I think we can look beyond the pandemic. I hope at some point we'll be able to look well beyond it. And I think the question that remains is, as we reflect on the experience of dealing with the pandemic, what lessons does it hold for other global crises, notably the unfolding climate crisis? So there's a lot there, but let me stop and turn this over to Calvin with my thanks, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much for those wonderful insights, Victor. With this, I think it'd be wonderful to hear from our expert panels now, or panelists, in fact. So may I also take this opportunity to invite everyone on the Zoom platform, if you should have any comments, thoughts, or questions, to enter them into the chat box. So we'll be able to see them and then present some of these points or comments to our panelists. So in terms of the panel discussion, let me start off by inviting Professor Vivian Lin to share her thoughts. So Vivian was the chair of public health at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And then following that, she was the director of health systems at the Western Pacific Regional Office of the World Health Organization. So Vivian, very keen to hear some of your thoughts on the work hopefully our chapter as well, the one that's by Daisy and myself. So over to you, Vivian. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kelvin, for the invitation and the opportunity to read, I think, what is really a fabulous volume. And thank you, Victor, for organizing this mammoth effort. As I was reading it, I was recalling how it was nearly exactly a year ago that I abandoned a 3-week-long international trip and returned to Hong Kong, the safety and security of Hong Kong early. And I've been here ever since, like everyone else. So it's incredible that this work has come out in such a short time. So can I congratulate Victor and indeed all the authors? It's a remarkably coherent book. Now, those of you who've been, involved in editing books, it's like a herding cats exercise. And this clearly is a huge amount of work that went into, whether it's a country chapter, whether it's an institutional chapter, whether it's about the economy and the environment. There is a consistency in the way that these chapters are done, and that gives the book an overall sense of coherence. And indeed, there's a section and a chapter for everyone, because it's so broad that there will be areas that you don't know anything about. And so everyone will find something that they can learn. So it's remarkable for its diversity of country coverage. I think there's only about 5 countries in Asia that I managed to count that were not included. And also it's a remarkably multidisciplinary group. Victor mentioned 61 authors. I counted 29 from law. So that's just under half. There's another 11 from variety of social sciences, plus there are people from area studies, business and industry, engineering, and public health. So a fantastic effort. And for any student or practitioner of public health policy, I would say you would do well to really read the book and appreciate really this larger context for how the technical arguments around the pandemic really play out in a real world setting. Let me comment on 3 different aspects. I want to pull out some themes. I want to talk about my favorite chapters, and I want to give some thoughts about the next steps. In the editor's introduction, there were 2 themes highlighted, that there were varying governance responses to the pandemic, and that points to the crucial importance of governance. I couldn't agree with that more. Victor also suggests that there are lessons for the future that relate to planning and practice, to leadership and governance, transparency and legitimacy. And of course, these are all aspects of governance. But from a public health policy viewpoint, I think there are some aspects that are really came through just about all the chapters that I think are really important for the public health policy makers. One is the xenophobia across communities in so many different countries. How do we take account of that? How do we work with that? How do we prevent that in the future? A second is the flip side, which is the incredible solidarity we also saw from communities. And while historically public health approaches to communicable disease control often tended to be state-driven, top-down, what we saw with this prolonged episode with this pandemic is the importance of community solidarity. So from a public health policy perspective, there's a lot to be learned, to be worked with now and into the future. All of which really points to this more fundamental governance question is, how do we build the trust in our institutions and in the variety of not only state institutions, but social institutions, and develop a collaborative governance approach to the present and future pandemics. And recognize, as it comes across in the book, that the place of law is really a matter of politics and institutions. And we would all do well to understand how to work with that dynamic. So as we saw in the pandemic, all the fault lines in every country has been exposed: social, economic, political. But as the book illustrates also so well, there were so many contradictory forces in societies, economies, and politics. So in many ways, COVID was a catalyst for existing trends rather than an introducer of new trends. And so if COVID really cast a light on the human condition during a pandemic, and the historians amongst us would know that we've seen this in other pandemics. So then the question is, what is the human capability for learning from history? So these are some of the sort of high-level themes that emerge for me. Now, let me go to my favorite chapters. And for me, there was 3 sets of insights that came from these chapters that I personally really appreciated. The first one is new ways of thinking. Now, one chapter is the one on governing through contagion. And this takes a Foucauldian approach to talk about 3 interlocking modalities of power. One is judicial, which prescribes and sanctions particular forms of behavior. And I think we all live with that for the last year. The second is disciplinary, and we all exercise that, but in doing so, it also shapes a certain morality and a certain sort of stigmatism that occurs in the way that we view each other. The third is security, in the way that social relations of individuals and populations are coordinated and defined. And the chapter suggests that the human response, again, we see all this, is to resist and to survive at the same time. So we draw on memories of history, we have our ideals of how we fight, how we heal. So I thought this was a really interesting chapter for us all to just reflect on our own lived experiences. Where is each of us and the communities that we identify with in this complex set of institutional and community dynamics and emotions? And through our own reflection, how do we move forward in terms of the roles that each one of us plays? So I like that chapter because it caused me to think more deeply. But the other chapter I thought really made me kind of conceptualize things differently was the one on Southeast Asian workers in the just-in-time pandemic. Now, this is, of course, refers particularly to the migrant workers, but what I really liked about this chapters was it wasn't just about our standard dichotomies of developed and developing countries, of low and high socioeconomic status, of secure and insecure employment, all of which are important in the way that we've described the pandemic. But what this just-in-time economy is saying, the unhealthy conditions are generated by a new terrain. And this is one interregional trade and travel. And we can think of many Belt and Roads, not just the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but the global economy is a series of Belt and Roads. But along these Belt and Roads is the concentration of population in new production centers in this long supply chain. And we saw how our supply chains were disrupted by the pandemic. But with these supply chains, we also see that the state exerts certain powers in their position in the global economy and in their attempt to compete successfully. And it is these weak social policies that then create the vulnerability of migrant workers who are situated in these production networks. And this combination of this flow of economy and people coupled with weak social policy framework that creates the vulnerabilities. Now, I thought that was really interesting because the question it raises is, if global competitiveness pressures and the production and distribution networks encouraged the clustering of unhealthy conditions and facilitated the global disease transmission in this instance, then what do we have to do to build back better? You know, are these conditions going to predict the next pandemic? Or can we do something to avoid this set of dynamics being recreated again? Clearly, fragmented nationalism is not the solution for the economy or for global health. So what is a global health collaboration or global governance for health look like in a future globalized economy? So I like those chapters because it made me think about things that I hadn't thought about before. But on the other hand, the other set of two favorite chapters were the ones I could take away really practical recommendations forward. And the first one of this was about pandemics and emergency powers in Asia. And this is Victor's chapter. And it was a chapter that very clearly outlines and compares the uses of constitutional emergency powers, ordinary statutory powers, specialized statutory and regulatory measures, and implicit or other executive powers. Now, what I liked about this, as a non-lawyer, but a policy person, is oftentimes, you know, you live with the history of how legislation came about, what tools you have, you try and work with it. But when we start to move forward, this is what Scott Burris would call legal epidemiology, and the importance of trying to learn actually what sorts of things can work better. And of course, what things work with alongside other institutions. So how do we prepare? What do we need to do for the next event? And so how do we link the effectiveness of legal measures with the ability of institutions to translate scientific evidence into practice? So very practical, very helpful, very clear chapter. The other one was the international health regulations and compliance in Asia. Now, over the last year, we've heard lots of criticisms of the WHO and the international health regulations and the WHO being insufficient. What this chapter does is to actually really look at how, at the end of the day, it is the political leadership and national public health capacity that is really important for compliance with the international health regs. So national responsibility is at the core, but beyond the national regulatory capacity is the question of institutional capacity. And this chapter points to the Asia-Pacific Strategy for Emerging Diseases, or 𝐓𝐴D, which was really a creature of this part of the WHO, and suggests that because it was this umbrella and the focus on national capacity building that could perhaps explain some of the success of Asia. Now, one could look at this, and it's quite interesting because when we think about WHO in Asia, we have two regions, the Western Pacific region, the Southeast Asia region. 𝐓𝐴D, while it's bi-regional, it is driven much harder from the Western Pacific region and implemented more fully. So maybe that also explains some of the intra-Asia differences in this pandemic. The chapter goes on to also recommend room for improvement in IHR, and specifically to mandate a general health alert for all populations. so that it's not just up to the states to report. And I think that's a really helpful suggestion, and also recognizes that so much of IHR coming from that top-down communicable disease perspective misses the issue of health literacy and the importance of the community as a partner in managing this. So that's the second theme I liked, which is learning how to govern better. The third one, I just wanted to highlight a few things that I think really illustrates the complexity of decision making, because governments are dealing with contradictory forces and there are many policy and management dilemmas. So some of the chapters on Singapore, technocracy and transition, in South Korea's democracy and surveillance, Indonesia's very vexed response, and Sri Lanka's catalyst for backsliding, all point to these interesting dilemmas of, do you do the top-down expedient governance, or do you have a narrative around social solidarity and bring people along? Do you use your technology to manage the public's health emergency, or how much room do you give to concerns about individual freedom? How does the competition between government agencies, between different levels of government, between different social institutions drive? Do you let the politics drive your response? Or do you let the pandemic be your excuse to take control of and strengthen your executive power? But in doing so, do you start to exceed that public tolerance in a procedural democracy? So I think these are really, really interesting questions about governance. Shows that the choices, decisions in an emergency is of the moment, but they are never far away from the social and political context. And I think the lesson I take away from that is that, the pandemic at the end of the day is absolutely local. That's how we all experience it. There's a response which is national, and it is also a global pandemic with a global transmission. So with the vulnerabilities magnified, and with this interconnections across economies, populations, how do we recognize that freedom is not an individual matter, but freedom is actually interconnected, and solidarity and global cooperation is actually not separate from the question of freedom? So I love these chapters and the kind of issues they brought out. Now, finally, looking towards the future, and I realize I've exceeded my allotted time because this is so interesting. The book raises some interesting questions about questions for the future. Does democracy or authoritarian government matter? What is the relationship between science and policy making? What is the role of the non-state actors, and what are the challenges for the future? I actually had also a very recent opportunity to preview a forthcoming book done by political scientists called Coronavirus Politics, and it holds some early answers to these questions. So I hope that the authors from both books can actually cooperate in the future. Some of the preliminary answers suggest that it's not democracy versus authoritarianism, but the diversity of an authoritarian regime could be more important, and it might be worth a closer look at. And health policies are dependent on social policies, and you have some strong states with strong public health infrastructure, but ultimately it's not those institutional strength, but the use of state capacity that actually matters. So public health and law are actually not very far apart from each other. alongside the whole governance approach. So I think these are some of the issues. I would love to see, so here's some proposals for Victor and other authors, that the next book might do some more in-depth comparative analysis across comparable systems, comparable cultures, and include the question of national cultural values and the extent to which they matter, because also the research around gender, and so that's a whole other dimension, seems to suggest that the national culture values that tend to elect women have also done better. So I think this is an interesting dimension. I would love to know whether, as we go beyond this first and look at second, third, and fourth waves, what countries are better at learning and adapting? And how many countries have actually made changes in laws, social policies, economic policies as they prepare for returning? I would love to see more on how regional partnerships have evolved, whether that's, ASEAN or other types of regional networks, the multilateral institutions and their roles in the region, how the trade agreements, supply chains, how all these have varied, shifted in our part of the world, whether we're seeing new emerging nodes, geopolitical and economic, which is based on pandemic management, the kind of bubbles. There could be multiple bubbles. And is this new way of thinking about our system rather than the traditional core and periphery type of concepts? And I would love to see some further work as the news starts to emerge about the origins of the virus, about what are we doing with a One Health approach? Can we bring greater coherence between animal health, human health, and look at policy coherence, legal coherence in the way that we move forward? And finally, I'd love to see some updates for some of the specific countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Singapore, as to whether the author's prophecies have come true. So thank you very much. And I'm sorry that my comments have exceeded the time.
Well, thank you so much, Vivian. That was brilliant. So I obviously do not envy Victor's position moving forward, taking up, well, at least some of the points that you have suggested. But first, let me invite Matthew, who has been working very closely with Victor, to perhaps respond to some of the comments we've heard from Vivian, and also in thinking about what has become this particular edited volume. I'd also like to invite Matthew to speak a bit about perhaps some of the future developments that we could perhaps anticipate. So over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Calvin, for the invitation. And thanks to the previous panelists. Vivian, I think you raised some incredibly important conversation topics and questions, and I really wish we had more time tonight to discuss those at length. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria, and I co-authored the introductory chapter along with Victor, so we worked fairly closely on that chapter. And I tried to inject a little bit of public health and epidemiology into the book kind of throughout as well, and acted as a bit of a secondary reader on some of the chapters, making sure that we were using proper public health terminology. And as was kind of rightly pointed out by a couple of individuals in the Q&A so far, this book really only covers the first wave kind of containment measures. And of course, we've come a long way since then, and we're witnessing second and third waves in some countries. And we've seen the successful development of specific vaccines and the rollout in very different ways in different parts of the world. And so there is a lot of room for conversation and updates on kind of where we've come in terms of the role of governance in the last 8 months that weren't covered by the book. But I do think that this book provides really excellent context for those first wave containment measures. And what's really fascinating from a public health perspective is that we can look at the direct responses of governments, and we immediately saw the impacts of those responses. We saw the first wave containment measures have immediate effects on the infection rate and the mortality rate due to COVID-19 in these different contexts. And while we can say that particular governments were probably constrained here and there due to perhaps limited resources or perhaps political tensions within the population or the government, or due to a divided populace or differences of opinion around the containment measures that were put in place, it's really still undeniable that the governments made crucial decisions with their existing capacity, and that those actually affected the public health effectiveness of their overall response. And we in the book kind of can divide these up in different ways, but I think that some of the most important themes that arose out of the book is that, for one, although as I just mentioned, the responses were usually at the regional or national level, as Vivian rightly pointed out, ultimately this was a global problem. And I think looking to the future, a lot of my concerns around the takeaway and lessons is what is our global health system going to look like in 10 or 20 years? And what are we going to take away from this pandemic in terms of establishing better infrastructure, hopefully reducing the amount of nationalized kind of sentiments and responses that we're seeing now, and actually trying to address these types of emerging infectious diseases as global issues, because they are. So if we go back to the national responses, though, we can look at countries that took the threat seriously, and we can look to countries like Taiwan, like Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, Vietnam, these places where there were immediate restrictions on travel, there was rapid testing, aggressive contact tracing, and these things really paid dividends in terms of looking at the epidemic curve. And many individuals and governments and members of the media rightly pointed out that these countries that were so successful in a lot of places were often countries that had dealt previously with pandemics or with epidemics. So looking at SARS in 2003 and Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2013, and that they learned from these experiences and actually institutionalized specific governance measures in order to respond immediately to emerging threats, and that they then use those mechanisms in the case of COVID-19. If we look at other countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar, these countries often establish slower, kind of decentralized, often poorly coordinated responses. And then other countries, we can look at another category of countries which Vivian mentioned, kind of, some of the more authoritarian types of powers that enforced fairly strict, kind of almost militaristic lockdown and surveillance measures that were ultimately effective to varying degrees against the spread of the virus ultimately. And then, there were countries that took kind of a middle ground approach, and we can look at Japan and Malaysia and Cambodia, in which, their approach was similar to what we saw in Canada, which involved travel restrictions and public education and maybe partial lockdowns, but perhaps not this large, comprehensive, coordinated, well-resourced effort. And like I said, we can then track these kinds of different governance and control measures forward in time and actually look at things like infection rates and mortality rates and case fatality rates. And we can compare across countries, and we can see what worked and see what didn't work. And that I see as being one of the enormous kind of benefits of this type of retrospective analysis of the initial first wave containment measures, is what can we learn worked and didn't work, and what can we institute moving forward in a global health system to try to ensure that we're prepared in the future, and that any response is ultimately equitable as well. And Vivian mentioned the certain populations like migrant populations and low resource populations within high income countries that were overlooked perhaps in these types of responses. And whether it be by luck or geographic or demographic differences or these successful government interventions, many places still never really experienced those huge spikes that we saw in specific other countries, looking at the US and Spain and Italy and to some extent Canada even, and largely avoided the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what can we learn from those countries that essentially stamped this thing out and stamped it out early? So ultimately, there's really little doubt that various government policies influenced the emergence and the spread of COVID-19 and the virus that causes it. But the severity differed across regions, and government responses should be ultimately kind of justified and examined for lessons as the future. And so I think that this book does an appropriate job of kind of doing that. Now, looking ahead to the future, I have several questions, I think, that kind of build off of some of Vivian's questions that will be really, really important, I think, to continue doing these types of retrospective and prospective analyses to try to determine what works and what doesn't when it comes to emerging infectious diseases and the future risk of pandemics. And it'll be interesting, I think, to see kind of how everything plays out, since COVID-19 in many cases has actually exacerbated existing political tensions, has underlined or has underscored some of the existing issues that exist within those countries, as again Vivian so rightly pointed out. If we look, for example, what is happening, I think, in the United States right now. I know this is a book about Asia, but it's hard it's hard to look away from what's happening, I think, in that country. And we can see kind of direct linkages between COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests. We can look at the response of Trump in comparison to Biden, and we can also see, I think, we've witnessed, due to various reasons, I think, but COVID-19 is certainly one of them, and the fact that we're all perhaps going a little bit stir-crazy, that we've seen this kind of explosion of conspiracy theories and these types of beliefs that ultimately undermine public health authorities and lead to a mistrust of public health decision-making. And this is something that I think really concerns me moving forward. If ultimately on a global scale, we undermine the trust in our public institutions, and particularly our public health institutions, what is going to happen during the next pandemic, or what's going to happen when we really need to rely on those decisions for institutional decision-making for the greater good? And I think what is needed is not the kind of nationalistic type sentiments and responses, which is what we're seeing now with respect to the vaccine rollout, for example, but instead better building up and supporting of international infrastructure like the World Health Organization and the international health regulations to ensure that we're actually prepared as a global network of citizens for future pandemics. I think I'll kind of leave it there. There's so many lessons, I think, to be learned, and we can look at the vaccine rollout and from a global health equity perspective, that's a particularly interesting process that's ongoing right now, where we're seeing countries like the US, like Israel have experienced an enormous amount of success with their vaccine rollouts for the most part. Whereas the vaccine, as of March 1st, we had our first vaccine put in the first person's arm in the whole continent of Africa, lagging behind by about 2 months many of the high-income countries that are already well on their way in their vaccine distribution rollouts. And so these things concern me, I think, because looking ahead to the future, we need to ensure that we're creating a more equitable global health system, because ultimately public health is global health. So I'm going to leave it there, and thanks very much, Calvin, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was brilliant. So I think some great points there to see how we get a degree of agreement, so to speak, in terms of what we've heard from Vivian and also some of the reflections from Matthew. I thought at this point it would be helpful to invite Daisy to share some points from the very local setting of Hong Kong. So having written the chapter about initial response that's taken up in Hong Kong, how do we see the future? And I thought that Daisy will be very well placed to speak to some of these concerns. So over to you, Daisy.
Thank you so much, Calvin. And I have tremendous job of following after so many very insightful comments and questions. So all of the very important questions and comments that have been raised so far are very relevant to the Hong Kong context. And in light of the time, I'm just going to offer very brief comments and remarks on our particular chapter and our particular context, and then hopefully open it up for wider discussion on all of these very great points before. To sort of to repeat a bit of what Calvin said, I was one of the contributing authors of the chapter, which is called Hong Kong, the Healthcare Professions and the Outbreak. And I'm just going to say a few words, as I mentioned, about the Hong Kong context and on our chapter. Here in Hong Kong, as we are staring down the barrel of a possible fifth wave of infections, while also reeling from the devastating impact of the pandemic on our economy and the countless businesses that have suffered from prolonged social restriction measures, COVID-19 and the government's response remains very much a live issue. And since writing this chapter, the government's handling of the pandemic has continued to be the subject of controversy, including its controversial use of emergency powers to lock down residential areas with little support. And here, obviously, Victor's input and his chapter would be very useful as a reference. And also recent controversies regarding the isolation and physical restraint of young children, both executed seemingly with little concern for the mental health of the citizens involved. Other controversies, of course, include the 21-day hotel quarantine requirement, which has caused a significant financial and mental health impact on travelers, while also permitting quarantine and surveillance exemptions for exclusive groups, which was previously shown to be a source of outbreak in previous waves. So in light of these ongoing controversies, a book like this, which really explores the law and policy context of Asian jurisdictions during the early months of COVID, is hugely important in allowing us to critically reflect on the types of trade-offs that have been made, and in particular, what has worked and what hasn't. Now, in what we hope is a helpful addition to this discussion, we consider in our chapter the early months of the COVID-19 outbreak in Hong Kong, tracing developments from late December 2019, when the people of Hong Kong were first introduced to the virus via reports of cases in Wuhan, up until the end of the second wave in May 2020, looking, for example, at the government's response at various stages of the development. Our chapter then considers the role of the healthcare profession, and in particular, the February strike and raising public awareness of the dangers of COVID-19 at a crucial moment in the development of the pandemic, as well as in sending a strong signal that our healthcare system was at imminent risk of being overwhelmed. So we argue that while, of course, at this stage, the legality of the strike and the constitutionality of the statutory limits on healthcare workers' rights to strike are unclear, the strike could have had an overall positive effect on the containment of COVID-19 for these reasons. So just to sum up, a book like this provides us with an extremely valuable comparative tool with which we can evaluate our situation in Hong Kong. And in reading the experiences of our neighboring jurisdictions and reflecting on our own, we hopefully will be able to assess and improve our response to this ongoing crisis in a way that takes into account the core principles and values that need to be defended even in times of crisis. But thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say, Calvin. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was brilliant, Daisy. So I think at this stage, it will be very timely to re-invite Victor to respond to the very many insights and comments, including proposals on the way forward. Victor, I thought perhaps I might take this opportunity to invite you to speak to some of the comments or questions that came through the chat box. And as you've seen, Harry has got a question concerning what we might expect of the global health governance regime, particularly in terms of stateless individuals or especially vulnerable individuals like low-wage migrant workers. So I'm not sure if there's been too much opportunity to deal with that topic. I think some of the chapters have, but certainly a lot more to think about on that front. And then also, of course, some questions relating to developments that we have seen in subsequent waves of the outbreak and also in other jurisdictions beyond Asia. So if I may now invite you to, well, speak to these formidable challenges, that will be brilliant. Thanks again, Victor.
Thanks very much, Calvin. And certainly it is a daunting task to have to respond to these great questions. And frankly, part of the reason why I tried to put together a book with 61 contributors is because I don't think any one person can give a response. Although I must say I'm humbled by the tremendous comments, Vivian and Matt and Daisy. It's really terrific. I'm not sure how much I can add to what they've said. But let me try to respond to a few points. Certainly on the question of the vaccine, I think in some ways it is, as the previous speakers have said, it is in some ways a continuation of the governance challenges that have been identified. One would have thought that after the experience of the pandemic, there would be a sort of a real movement towards international coordination, some centralized response, sort of in that spirit of solidarity that, you know, we're all in this in different ways, but what we do in lower or higher income countries has an impact globally. And yet we've seen the challenge of trying to get to that level of international coordination. So I think it's very much a live question how quickly lessons are learned, and the challenge of politics, whether it's on the local level or the global level, often as Vivian and others have mentioned, the politics and the sort of social and cultural challenges are never that far away from the larger public health and law and policy responses. So let me see, that was just going to look at the other questions that were raised. So so yes, thank you, Justin, for raising that question. And you're absolutely right that this is going to be, the whole sort of question of vaccine diplomacy is going to be a live issue for the next few months or years, actually. Harry's question, oh, sorry, maybe I shouldn't be mentioning names, but thank you for that question. Migrant workers, and yes, I think it's clear, and many of the chapters have spoken to this question of vulnerable populations. And as we've seen in many places, this is where the virus spreads. And I think Vivian mentioned the chapter on the just-in-time economy, and which speaks directly to the question of migrant workers. We've seen how in several jurisdictions these populations have been invisible or ignored or not at the center of public health responses, and that takes us back to the politics. And the same is true of refugees and forced migrants and other vulnerable populations. So we've seen this certainly in refugee camps and across the region. So yes, I think having that's certainly going to be an issue going forward, and it sort of ties back into that question of supporting lower income countries in their efforts to roll out the vaccine, as Matt has mentioned. I'm not sure, I don't want to take up a lot of time because there may be other questions, but I do have something like 7 or 8 pages of notes here, and I'm not sure I can really do justice to all of the comments, except to thank the readers, thank Vivian and Daisy and Matt for the thoughtful engagements. I'm not sure at this point I have much to add, except by way of agreement that there is a lot more to do, and I hope we might be able to get to a second edition at some point and take on board all of these rich comments and suggestions. So rather than trying to respond fully to those comments, maybe I'll hand it back to you, Calvin, and see if we want to invite a broader discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Victor. I'm afraid that might be just about all the time we have. But before we finish off, maybe get a bit of a preview in terms of what the second edition might look like now that we've got more experience with this particular pandemic. I'm especially interested in two aspects of Vivian's question. So that pertains to whether or how we could understand health systems as actually learning from experiences gained through this particular public health event. And also this issue of trust. I think what almost all of the chapters seem to suggest will be a complexification of this particular notion. Of course, it's no longer adequate just to understand the relationship between public health institutions or the state more generally and communities as simply hierarchical, something that you've also alluded to at the start of the presentation. And these, I think, have got vast implications of how we are to understand law and legal development. So are these some of the issues that you think might be featured in the second edition?
Well, when you put it that way, Calvin, how could I say no? I say absolutely. And I think that was a really insightful point on Professor Lin's part, that idea of learning. And I think this was reiterated by Matt and, as well, that some of the most successful responses were by those jurisdictions that had were at the forefront of the response to SARS or MERS, and really sort of thought carefully about what legislative framework needed to be in place and how would that legal response be implemented through various agencies. And in the case of Singapore, the idea of a whole of government response. So, and as some of the our colleagues mentioned, that in some ways this cut across different forms of governments as well. So what is it about the institutional response? What is it about that process of learning? I like that, very much like that idea of health systems as sort of learning, that iterative experience of learning from past mistakes. And I think it does tie into that the question of trust as well, right? I think the public is understanding when something new comes up, and there's sort of the sense that, well, we do have to respond and on the fly to developments. But those governments that sort of take those lessons on board, I think, command a lot more trust, right? When we see that they try something, it doesn't work, and they look to best practices across the region or across the world and say, okay, well, let's try this because this worked in our neighboring country or in another context. So I think it does come back to the question of who ultimately takes the lead in these contexts, right? Is it the politicians? To what extent do the politicians respond to misinformation, disinformation, or to what extent do they sort of take the lead from public health experts and the science, the best available science at the time, and try to adjust policies based on the evidence? And that ultimately, I think, goes back to that question of trust. So yes, I think both of those themes will be central to a second edition once we get there.
Okay, right.
Thanks very much,
Calvin. So much, Victor. So, so this will be continuing conversation for many, if not all of us. So please do let me invite everyone who's on the Zoom platform to stay tuned. More information or more details will be available through our website. Finally, I'd like to again thank Victor for having spearheaded this very important initiative, and also like to thank Matthew and Vivian, as well as Daisy, for having joined in this particular conversation. Thank you so much for your insights, all your contributions and recommendations. And of course, finally, to all the participants who having joined us in this particular conversation, thank you so very much. So with this, have a very pleasant day or night ahead, depending on which part of the world you're at. And I look forward to being in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Calvin. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.